Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about Realms of Chaos in Total War Warhammer 3. A uniquely awful map in the history of Total War. Here I have a campaign as Nakari turn 46. I have occupied a good amount of territory, vassalized a decent number of factions, including Scarbrand. How I pulled that off, well, I just beat them up and then sold him some territory. That's fairly simple, actually. Imagine turning Khorne's greatest bloodthirster against them. Oh yes, that is a hilarious situation. And it is exactly what Slaanesh would try and do. I mean, Scarbrand should be embarrassed about himself, really. But when we're looking at this particular map, there are a number of things that combine to create an awful experience. Not just one particular issue with this map. It's almost every single major decision that Creative Assembly made with respect to Warhammer 3 that creates an awful gaming experience on this map. Of course, we first have to talk about the rifts. Now, the problem with the rifts is well known. First off, when these rifts spawn, and when armies start spawning out of them on a global scale, you end up with a major performance impact. That in itself is not exactly a fun experience, and I wish they had learned that lesson for Total War Pharaoh. Creative Assembly has had a questionable relationship with regards to performance in their games. It always feels like their developers don't care enough about, like, hey, this game may not run so well if we do decision X with respect to mechanics in their game. It doesn't matter. It's rule of cool. Well, rifts aren't cool. Whoever thought they were going to be a cool mechanic, well, they didn't know what they were doing. And the performance impact certainly ruins it. But the problem with these rifts is that you know they're going to come. You know they're going to be essentially in every province, and you have a couple of decisions with respect to that. The first decision is to obviously close them, using heroes or recruiting an saving up resources and recruiting emergency armies when they spawn in order to close them. The battles themselves, the initial battles at least, the first ones, aren't too bad, but it does mean that even expanding across this kind of territory, you have to worry about them in your campaign being an issue. Now, they won't spawn everywhere, but they'll spawn in enough places that it will actually have a major impact. What this does is it slows you down. It slows your campaign pacing down, which is a problem, because the way you succeed in Total War, and this is the case in every Total War, is by being very aggressive in the early game. The rifts themselves are the first mechanic, and not the only one, that slow you down. That are meant to slow you down. But they don't do so in a great way. They do so in this way where it's not the dynamic gameplay, the AI, or the AI cheats, or the capability of the AI that slows you down. It's just a mechanic that happens for 32 turns in that will slow down your campaign pace. The impact of this and other decisions is that basically what Creative Assembly has created here, they've created the perfect storm of events, including these rifts, where you effectively have to play a campaign and win the campaign by turn 30, or else you're going to lose it in the long term. Or you're going to end up significantly diminished. Now, one of the myths that was created when Immortal Empires came out was the idea that, oh, Realms of Chaos was harder. There's some truth, I suppose, to that. I mean, you look at Kebie over here, you look at the situation with Miaoyin, for instance. She's got 3 armies over here that I have, 4 armies, 5. She's got 5 armies over here by turn 46. But the reason she's got this many armies is because she has no natural rivals to consistently destroy her armies. That's the reason, one of the reasons the AI doesn't create as many armies in a campaign. In Immortal Empires, a lot of the factions are constantly at war with each other. So over here, Kebie just building up a significant number of armies is a problem. I would not want to invade Kebie here. But certainly this can contribute to the notion that this is difficult. But you look at other factions, right? The problem here is it's kind of artificial, because the reason these major factions have so many armies is because they just don't have anyone to fight them, any other AI faction, so they're expanding unopposed. You're certainly not expanding unopposed, and you certainly don't have the economic potential the AI has, at least on Legendary. By the way, what's with this? Look at this faction. This is so absurd. They only got one army, but they've got so many lords. It's like the Tong are just like recruiting as if there's no tomorrow. That is genuinely hilarious to actually witness in a campaign. Yeah, the AI is not cheating necessarily more in this campaign than it is in Immortal Empires. It's just that because Legendary Lords are fairly spread out compared to Immortal Empires, and a lot of factions don't necessarily have natural rivals for a fairly long time, you end up in this kind of situation where the AI, who obviously has far more economic benefits than you, just ends up cheating the hell out of it and benefiting from those cheats. Now, this is something similar in Old World, but there's another thing that has to be added to this. Beyond the rifts being created and causing an issue, you also have to talk about the souls. The way to win the campaign, you've got two choices. Either you go smash the entire campaign map, which is like, yeah, I'm not going all the way to Cathay for unpleasant climate. I'll talk about the climate situation in just a moment. But you can either destroy every other major faction on the map, which is ridiculous. And like, look at the situation. Like, Scarbrand is my vassal. Kairos is an ally in this situation. Nurgle, yeah, okay. I may destroy Nurgle, but the idea that you have to destroy every other faction is not particularly great. So, to win, you need to deal with these souls. Now, the problem is the souls don't mesh well with Total War gameplay, because they're going to cause you to go into the Realms of Chaos. Yeah, I mean, they're not showing up over here, but they're going to cause you to go into the Realms of Chaos. Actually, Miao Ying has 6 armies. Holy shit, she's insane. And you're wasting turns. There's nothing interesting or compelling or even really challenging in the Realms of Chaos. Because the challenge in a campaign is not individual battles. It's like building up a massive empire to tackle the AI who's also building its own empire. That's really the challenge. That's the reason rogue armies and endgame crises and all that don't really work. I think the only game which was quote-unquote challenging was Attila, but the way that worked is like, yes, you had the Huns constantly being created as armies, but they were just never-ending, and it was also too much. I think Creative Assembly is always struggling to create an idea how to make the endgame interesting, and the way they do it, the way they've been doing it for quite a few years now, since Attila, we're still in that mentality. Oh, Attila was great. No, it wasn't. I'm going to say it. Attila was not a great game. The ideas it had were not great ideas. The fact that Creative Assembly is still using those ideas years down the line is not exactly conducive towards a great campaign experience. Especially because, as I stated, you win the early game, you win before the first rift spawn if you haven't effectively created a stable campaign situation where you can send an army for a rift. You're going to lose the campaign. And then you waste a significant number of turns of your campaign going through the rift, pursuing souls, getting very little in return, and also the cherry on top of this awful cake is you get a negative trait that may take several turns to remove. Creative Assembly doing that, like, I feel if they wanted to have the soul race, the entire campaign, or a vast majority of it, should have been taking place in the Realms of Chaos. And you were not necessarily conquering territory, but you had like expeditions in the Realms of Chaos. You'd move them in, you'd move them out, you had more flexibility, not just like, oh, you send an army every 30 turns, you waste 10 turns with that army, and it's your main army in the Realms of Chaos in order to get the soul. And you fight a bunch of boring battles that are predefined, so first time they might be fun, but after that, they certainly lose their charm. That's the second thing. Like, the entirety of the Rift situation is just not great with respect to this map. Another issue is that all of the races, the baseline races of Warhammer 3, be it Kislev, the demons, ogres, with major exception of Cathay, but all of them were designed to be limited in some way. Limited economy, limitations on how fast they could expand. So you couple that with the rifts, you couple that with the way the map is designed with distance between settlements, so you're not getting as much post-battle loot because you're not fighting as many battles, you don't have as many armies in your campaign, all that. You end up with a campaign pace that feels glacial in comparison. You might have to win a campaign in the first 30 turns, but actually building up a proper empire, unless you're Kebie, takes time. And Kebie was designed to have their own severe limitations, like for instance, having to deal with constant invasions on the Great Bastion, being at war with demonic factions, and factions inside. But like Kebie is the ultimate example, like how the early game was very important and everything else was not so important in a campaign. The reason I'm saying that is because if you look at Kebie campaign, like look at Miao Ying's campaign. She starts with 2 rebel factions. Let's say she only has to deal with Alain because the dissenters will be dealt with by Xiao Ming. Okay, she has that situation, but then she has a siege faction in the Terracotta Graveyard. She's got Norskins beyond the gate. She's got Kairos. She's got the Stink Gate destroyed. This is one of those campaigns that just really represents how the early game was really busted. And if you're playing this campaign on Legendary, to be certain about how it ended up working with respect to it, you end up in this awful early game situation. But if you can handle that early game, and that's one of the reasons like playing Xiao Ming was actually initially harsh when we didn't know the game. Like right now, I'd strongly recommend playing Xiao Ming even in this map. But initially, like playing Xiao Ming was just an awful experience. Not because he's worse than Miao Ying, he's actually stronger, he's always been stronger, but rather because he was not close enough to the Great Bastion to deal with all the issues that existed there. But you have these limitations, limitation after limitation or slow pace. Even Castorps have from this. Like, Castorps do take time to build their economy. They could really use more cash, more money, more money. It works in Immortal Empires because they can raid caravans and they can print money with laborers and they can find battle after battle. But if not for the post-battle loot, Castorps would have a much slower campaign pace. Now, I do believe that if Creative Assembly wants us to play a longer campaign, they should design that properly. The problem is, they design the way their difficulty is handled in virtually every game is the campaign is very front heavy, so the most important decisions are early on, but they also implement almost in every game, they implement systems that are just going to annoy you, and you can't win a campaign until like turn 100. Consider this campaign. It takes 140 turns to win the campaign, but you're limited. But once you overcome the early game, you no longer have to care about like building an empire. In fact, the game is deliberately built in such a way that building a massive world empire is really, really frustrating. Then we have to talk about the map itself. The terrain, the types of climate on the map, the limitations on climate, and the way the map is designed works against the player having any incentive whatsoever to build a massive empire. Like, consider campaign as Kebie. Kebie is a powerful race. They have a good economy. They have the potential to steamroll. Like, this is turn 20. I occupy the vast majority of Kebie, with the exception of Xiao Ming, Yan Bo, and the Burning Wind Nomads. But outside of that, I do own all of Kebie. I am unstoppable at this particular point. I have a very strong economy. I have multiple armies dealing with multiple issues. But there's nothing else in this campaign that I should do. Okay, there's some greenskins and ogres over here, but one, I'm going to be slowed by the mountains. Two, I'm going to be slowed down by the climate situation. And three, I'm going to be slowed down by everything else I've mentioned, dependent on the campaign I'm playing. Consider a Kislev campaign. You might say, oh, Kislev could conquer the empire. Sure. Though in this case, it does seem like Catherine's taking her sweet time dealing with Prague. But regardless, Kislev could technically conquer a vast swath of territory, because they can take mountains, they can take the entire empire. The problem is that Kislev also needs devotion to win in their campaigns. That's one of the big issues with racial design, is that a lot of these races are kind of designed in such a way to slow you down deliberately. The demon factions, none of them have a good economy. unless we're talking about sacking and looting settlements. And even then, Scarbrand is always going to play a campaign in the red. And they might have, like, factions may have territorial viability, but there's always something that slows them down, that stops them from really expanding across the entire map. In this case, like, you know, with Kislev, it's just like, you need devotion, so you need to fight chaos for a measure, even though a lot of the map is available. Now, with the Chaos Dwarves, that's certainly far more viable. If you play a Boris Ursus campaign, for instance, you can spend your entire campaign in the Darklands and then in the Mountains of Morn, but in a campaign as Katrin, that's certainly far less viable. Though you could just go from the mountains, from the Goromandi, all the way into the Mountains of Morn. But still, climate limitations in virtually every campaign play a major role. Because it's not just like, oh, the construction cost or recruiting units or anything like that. It's also casualty replenishment that is going to become a major issue. A lot of these races, like Kislev, has good casualty replenishment. Nurgle, of course, has it. Scarbrand does have it. The others of the baseline races don't. And like you see system after system after system, that's just slowing you down. Now the campaign is, the victory in the campaign is dictated in the early game, but you still have like 100 plus turns to win it, because winning a campaign takes that long, because you either have to take the entire map, or you have to wait for the portals to open 4 times for you to get the 4th soul in order to win the campaign over there. Which is, suffice to say, that is absolutely fairly annoying as a system. Like, it takes about 100 or close to 130 turns to get those portals to spawn, or 140, and then you have to go get, or be anywhere between 120 and 140 all that. But then you're realistically going to spend up until like 140 turns, where the campaign generally is won or lost within the first 30. And you have a lot of systems: economy, casualty replenishment, map design, climate limitations, the rifts, everything you can name, that's just going to slow you down. And then, of course, sure, you could play hyper aggressively, but like, consider this campaign as Cafe. The only climate that's viable for me is the Empire. Now, the portals do help you out a bit here, because you can send your main legendary lord for a portal. That's why Miao Ying is so deep in enemy lines here. I'm just moving her here from settlement to settlement, waiting for those portals to open. When they do open, I'm going to hop through one of them, and I'm going to go in the Empire with her army and establish an empire there. But even that's not really a great mechanic. Removing the rifts, like, there's a lot of mods. Creative Assembly has added that with buildings, and in every campaign since the original ones, they haven't used the rift mechanic because they realized how bad it was, or how there was major community outcry. But removing the rifts does not fix these issues. The map is still really boring without the rifts, and it's still going to slow you down significantly. Like, I've played campaigns as Jan Bo, the Changeling, Astankia, many campaigns since Immortal Empires came out. And I have to say, like, Realms of Chaos campaigns are still very, very slow. I mean, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with having to take multiple turns to get from settlement to settlement. There is a lot wrong when you're not really dealing with major threats. You're just constantly fighting the game systems as opposed to fighting a worthwhile opponent. Also, we can talk about how, like, vast majority of the battles you would fight in a campaign, and this is still the case, are going to be settlement battles. Now, they've removed the minor settlement component because that was always awful from the very beginning of the game. Like, beyond the novelty, when you play the first couple of those battles, beyond the novelty there, it really wore itself out very, very quickly in a campaign. But you would fight a lot of these settlement battles, not against any kind of, in a lot of cases, not against an opponent that would be a real challenge, but just because Autoresolve situation with that. Like, over here in this campaign, outside of, like, the only major challenge, quote unquote, in this entire campaign there's only 2 challenges that have existed in this entire campaign experience, and this kind of existed from the start with Miao Ying's campaign. You have the major battle against the Terracotta Graveyard that you want to defeat. Then you have to fortify the snake gate. That's not really an issue if you move quickly enough on that. But the major challenge is actually against Kairos. In this case, he threw himself at the snake gate after I had already rebuilt it. So he ended up losing. Between the garrison and the army over here because he didn't throw high quality troops. Like if he had come with an army of Forsaken, maybe he could have won. But he sent a bunch of blue horrors and marauder spearmen against Jade Warrior crossbowmen and Jade Warriors. Yeah, Autoresolve is kind of screwed when the AI thinks that's a good idea. And keep in mind the garrison that exists over here. Yeah, that is a bit ridiculous. So that is in conclusion the issue with like Immortal Empires. Also the map just looks awful, honestly. Like it's awful to navigate, it's awful to deal with. The shape of it doesn't make sense. Kebie is far better in Immortal Empires as an area. Like I guess the Chaos Wasteland over here, like the Western Chaos Wasteland, is interesting somewhat, but everything else, like every other part, the Empire, Kislev, Norska, they're not great parts of the map. Some parts are just only slightly larger than they are in Immortal Empires, which is pretty telling. Like, I'm all for having a more limited campaign map and a more limited campaign, but why did they squish down the Empire so much? Say what you will about the Vortex campaign, and it had its own issues. It did slow down with those Chaos Warriors and Skaven and Norskans. It did have its own issues, right? But the problem is, the difference is when you look at the Vortex campaign map, sure, you had systems that were going to slow you down, and you did have a war enforced between the major factions as they were fighting for control of the Vortex. But you could play a campaign and not worry about the Vortex at all over there, and you could still win it. Though thankfully at one point they stopped forcing the Vortex on every campaign at one point. But still, you look at a Vortex campaign map, the way the terrain is designed, the possibilities. Like if you're playing a campaign as Kislev, for instance, in this, and you want to really establish dominance, you have to, and you want to win the supporter race, get a lot of devotion, then you have to fight Chaos. So all your campaign is going to be spent in Kislev and, Norska. That's it. That's your campaign situation. You might send secondary armies and all that in Empire, but keep in mind that's kind of detrimental to your campaign success. Not because you're gonna lose on the devotion supporter situation. In that situation, but you end up fighting over the same territory again and again and again. Replayability becomes a major issue with this, and just the shape of the map, the way some of the campaigns are designed. Like Ostankia starting province is an awful piece of crap. Like, why do you have the dwarves right in the same province? Like, just detach Carrick. Doom over here, put it as part of another province. Thank you very much, because Ostankia's campaign, like if she was coming from the north, moving south, and she wasn't allied with the dwarves, then maybe that would work. But the way the map currently works, this settlement right here is a major bloody issue in a campaign for Ostankia. So Ostankia's campaign is awful. Kugav's not necessarily better when you're looking at it. I guess Kairos is okay to some extent, because he's the only one that can, use a teleport or some kind of underwrite in his campaign over here, so he's relatively safe. But yeah, a lot of the campaigns end up, you waste a lot of time, you don't necessarily have interesting foes. Like, you play a campaign as an Akari or Skarbrand, the only other opponent you're going to face for a very long time that's actually worth a damn is each other, basically. Like, you play a campaign as an Akari, it's like Skarbrand is the only major threat, quote-unquote only. But you defeat him, and that's pretty much your campaign. Like that's all there is in a campaign. You play a campaign as Miao Ying or Xiaoming or Kafang campaign, only Kairos is the major threat. And the constant invading Norskans on the passion, but you just farm those for experience at one point. You play a campaign as the Chaos Dwarves, you have no major threat to deal with in the entire campaign? No, seriously, like you have no major threat in a Chaos Dwarf campaign on this map. I'm not joking. Champions of Chaos are a bit different because you do have Kislev. You have to deal. Like if you're playing Valkia, you do have to deal with Kislev, but that's just kind of it. Like that's the only campaign. Like I guess Village does have the Demon Prince. If you think the Demon Prince is worth a damn in a campaign. So I really do think like with Immortal Empires they did do it better, because you do have those major threats to deal with. Dealing with Legendary Lords is generally a far better experience than no-name crappy faction. That's where I stand on it. And that's one of the things I really disliked about Warhammer 2, how a bunch of those no-name factions could be biblical threats. And the legendary lords, the interesting characters, were not necessarily so. They could become so. Like Tyrion, I'm sure Tyrion was an absolute nightmare for everyone that was having to fight him, but that's kind of it. Like a couple of those situations. Anyway, that's all there is to say over here. 2-year anniversary, almost 2 years since this game was launched with this particular map. You really gotta wonder what CA was thinking with this one. I'm not quite sure how they thought this was a great idea. But here's the thing. Many of the things they did here, be it like mechanics that are designed to slow down or limited economy. Do you know one of the problems that Pharaoh has? Exactly this. Like Pharaoh has constantly spawning horde armies that aren't really, that are more of an annoyance than a threat, and genuine threat, that escalate throughout the campaign. But really, it creates a situation in Pharaoh as well, where yeah, early on it's a nuisance, but then it's just like farming for experience. So that's annoying. Your economy is limited, which is weird in Pharaoh, considering like Troy was not limited. Settlements would generate far more resources because there were multiple resource production buildings in Troy. So you would end up with a significantly higher cache of resources in Troy than Pharaoh. And you weren't quite as limited in a campaign Troy. Like, Troy had its major issues, but, like, it seems with Total War Pharaoh, it's like the team behind Total War Pharaoh is like, oh, look at the Realms of Chaos map, let's copy it. Thankfully, they don't have the climate limitations, except they do, kind of. Because you don't have climate in as much of a sense, but you do have the issue of the desert. Still, I mean, you know, Pharaoh is a bit better, but it's like, all the awful decisions in Pharaoh come from this particular map. And I think Creative Assembly really needs to understand that when they're building a campaign, fundamentally, they need to understand people want to play fast. They don't want to click this button and have nothing to do. Like, that's the problem with a large campaign map when there's nothing to do and you have limited armies. Like, if we had more armies, as more factions except Cafe, if we could feel like, you know, 2 armies from a single province, from our starting province, and afford that, I think that would be a better campaign situation. For instance, whereas realistically we can only afford 1, if even that. That's one of the things that I would fundamentally change, like about how Total War campaigns are handled, because I think like you want to give people the flexibility that 2 full armies do involve. Now the problem, by the way, in a campaign in Total War these days is not like, oh, you need a general to lead an army. No, you need full stacks. You can't just send small stacks on various parts of the campaign map unless you're playing defense, and only to some extent. You need full stacks because the AI is going to build full stacks in a campaign, and the AI is certainly going to have a lot more resources than you will to be able to afford these stacks. Like over here, like, oh, you have Azazel. So you get used to this idea, this campaign, that the mentality that you get used to the notion that you're constantly going to be fighting factions that are going to outnumber at least 2 to 1, if not more so, in a campaign. And that can be harsh to learn. It certainly was initially in Realms of Chaos, but once you do get used to it, and you do, and you start abusing the system, it just becomes boring. Like, you don't have dynamic gameplay. Like, there's plenty of issues in Mortal Empires, but it's a far better map than this. And I think Old World has shown that, yeah, you can have a more focused map on certain areas, though fairly large still, that runs better than even this map. Like, surprisingly, Old World actually runs better than this map when the rifts spawn. You can have decent performance on a massive map, and you can have very interesting gameplay on a massive map. There's plenty of campaigns that do suffer because Old World is ultimately just a map. It's not changing the racial dynamics of how those races play, and the bad races are still ultimately bad. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.